The road south had been dissolving for 3 days, the snowmelt turning packed earth into something closer to river bottom than path, and the Ronin had been watching the same set of footprints since the second hour after dawn, small, deliberately spaced, the heel strike of someone who had learned to walk without sound but had not yet learned to walk without pattern. He noticed this the way he noticed most things, without intention, without urgency. The detail arriving in his awareness, the way a splinter works its way to the surface of skin, patient and inevitable. The prints were fresh enough that the edges had not yet filled with the slow seep of groundwater. Whoever had made them was perhaps 40 minutes ahead, moving steadily, not running, which meant either confidence or exhaustion. And the weight distribution in the mud, deeper at the ball of the foot, suggested exhaustion, wearing the mask of confidence. He adjusted the carry of his pack and kept walking. The cedar forest on either side of the valley road had been dripping since morning, the snow in the upper branches releasing in sudden soft collapses that hit the ground with a sound like a held breath let go. The light came through gray and flat, the kind of light that made distances hard to judge and gave everything the same unfinished quality, as if the world had been sketched but not yet committed to. His sandals were soaked through. They had been soaked through since the mountain pass 2 days back, and he had stopped noticing the cold in his feet, the way a man stops noticing the sound of a river when he camps beside it long enough. The cold was simply the condition of movement. The movement was simply the condition of being alive. He had reduced himself to these equations over the years and found them sufficient. The footprints continued south. So did he. At midday he stopped at a place where the road bent around a granite outcropping, and the cedar gave way briefly to open sky, and he ate dried fish and cold rice from the wrapping in his pack without sitting down, watching the road ahead and behind with the same flat attention. The prints were still there, still fresh, still telling the same story, someone who knew how to move but was burning through reserves they had not stopped to replenish. He could read the slight dragging quality that had entered the stride in the last half hour of tracks, the left foot in particular, the toe catching slightly on the upswing. Not injury. Fatigue accumulating in the muscles the way debt accumulates, invisibly, until the moment it isn't invisible anymore. He finished eating and walked on. It was not until the road dipped into the narrow valley section where the cedar closed back in, and the light dropped to almost nothing that he saw the figure, not the footprints, but the person making them, and understood that everything he had been reading in the mud was only half the story. The figure was crouched behind a cedar trunk perhaps 30 paces off the road, very still, watching a group of 4 men who had stopped in the middle of the path and were examining the same prints the Ronin had been following. The men were not soldiers, no formal equipment, no livery, but they moved with the organized purpose of people who had been sent somewhere specific to do something specific, which was in its own way more dangerous than soldiers following orders. Hired, focused. The kind of men who had agreed on a price and would not renegotiate once the work was in motion. The figure behind the cedar did not move. The Ronin stepped off the road into the tree line on the opposite side without changing his pace. Without looking at the figure, without any gesture that would register as acknowledgement, he moved through the undergrowth parallel to the road, keeping the group of 4 men in his peripheral vision, and continued south. He did not look back. After perhaps 200 paces, he stepped back onto the road and kept walking, and it was another hour before he heard footsteps behind him, careful footsteps, the kind that had learned something from close calls and did not turn around. The figure fell in perhaps 20 paces back and held that distance. He still did not turn around. The afternoon light was already failing when the road reached a post station, abandoned from the look of it. The roof of the main building partially collapsed on one end, and the wooden sign hanging at an angle that suggested the rope had been cut rather than rotted through. There was a secondary structure behind the main building, smaller, the roof intact. The door fitted with a wooden bar that had been left in the unlatched position. He pushed it open with 2 fingers and stepped inside and stood for a moment, letting his eyes adjust. A dirt floor. A raised wooden platform along one wall where travelers had once slept. A fire pit in the center, stone-ringed, the ash cold and old. Iron hooks in the ceiling beams for hanging gear. The smell of the place was cedar smoke and mouse, and the particular damp that meant the structure had been sealed for at least 1 winter season. He set his pack down on the platform and began unpacking what he needed for fire. The figure appeared in the doorway 3 minutes later, standing in the last gray light, not entering, not speaking. He did not look up from the tinder arrangement. "The roof holds on this side," he said, and said nothing else. What he saw, when he finally looked up as the fire caught and the light changed, was not a young man at all. The clothing had been convincing from a distance and in bad light, but close to the fire there was no distance and no bad light. And the face that looked back at him from across the room was the face of a woman in her late 20s who had arranged everything about her appearance to suggest otherwise, and who was now watching him with the specific quality of attention that belongs to a person waiting to find out whether a calculation has gone wrong. He fed a larger piece of cedar into the fire. She did not move from the doorway. "You were behind those men for 2 hours before they stopped," he said. Not an accusation, not a question. The statement of an observed fact delivered in the same register one might report the weather. "I know how to read a road," she said. "You do." He said, "Your left foot drags when you're tired." The silence that followed was not the silence of offense. It was the silence of someone recalibrating. She stepped inside and pulled the door closed behind her and set her own pack, smaller than his, more carefully arranged, against the wall nearest the fire, not the wall nearest the door, which told him something about how she was assessing the room's risks. She sat cross-legged on the edge of the raised platform and held her hands toward the heat without looking at them, looking instead at the fire itself with an expression that had been carefully constructed to reveal nothing and succeeded only partially. Her jaw was tight, had been tight for a long time from the look of the muscle. He unpacked the rest of what he needed and began assembling a simple meal without offering to share it or declining to share it, simply making enough of it that the arithmetic of portions was unambiguous without words. She watched this and said nothing, and he was aware, in the periphery of his attention, that this watching had a quality of someone who had learned not to ask for things, and was now encountering a situation in which not asking was itself a kind of asking. He set one portion at her end of the platform without comment and ate his own. After a long time she said, "You could have stayed on the road. I was cold." "You weren't cold before the bend in the road." He looked at her then. She was eating, had been eating, carefully, with the composed control of someone who was hungrier than they intended to show. And she met his look with the steadiness of someone who had decided some time ago that flinching cost more than it saved. "They're hired," he said. "I know what they are. How far behind? 2 hours when they stopped, less now." She paused. "They'll find this place." "Yes." "Then why stop here?" He looked at the fire. "Because you can't walk on that foot through the night." The silence that followed was different from the silences before it. It had weight in it, the specific weight of something named that both people had agreed not to name. And in the orange light of the cedar fire, her expression shifted in a way she did not fully control, something moving behind the composure like a shape moving behind paper. She looked down at her left foot without meaning to, then back up. And he had already looked away. The night came in fast, the way it did in the valley sections where the mountains pinched out the last of the skylight before the stars had a chance to compensate. Outside, the wind was moving through the upper cedar branches with a sound that rose and fell like breathing, and somewhere not far off a section of the collapsed main building groaned and resettled in a way that might, to someone less experienced, have sounded like footsteps. She stiffened once at that sound. He watched her recognize it for what it was and release the tension without drama, and the efficiency of that, the quick, accurate assessment. The lack of wasted response was the first thing that registered in him as something beyond simple observation. She spread her bedroll, thin, worn, the quilting compressed to near uselessness in several sections, on the raised platform, and removed her outer jacket, but kept everything else and lay down facing the fire with her back to the wall. He did the same on the other end of the platform, and they were perhaps 6 feet apart in the dark, the fire between them throwing its orange light against the ceiling beams, and the wind outside continued its long, slow breathing. Neither of them slept. He knew she was awake from the quality of her stillness, which had the particular controlled quality of someone managing their own alertness. She knew he was awake, he assumed, because she was paying attention. Around the middle of the night she said, without turning over, "What's south for you?" "Road. The road goes south to the pass and then to the coast." "I know. That's 3 weeks in this weather." "About that." A pause. The fire had burned down to coals that pulsed with the drafts from the door gaps, breathing orange and dim. "I have someone at the coast," she said, not explaining, simply placing the information. "Then that's where the road goes," he said. Another silence, longer. Then, "The men following me. They're not violent men, not by preference. They're hired to bring me back, not to hurt me, but there are degrees of that. I understand degrees." "I'm telling you," she said, with a precision in her voice that he recognized as the precision of someone who had thought this through and was delivering the conclusion, "so that you know what you're walking south beside." He said nothing for a moment. The coals pulsed. "I walked beside it all day," he said. "The road was the same." She did not respond to this, but in the long silence that followed, something in the quality of her breathing changed, a fraction, barely measurable. The kind of change that required a person to have been listening very carefully to even notice. And the Ronin, who had been listening carefully, noticed it and then looked at the ceiling and said nothing more. Morning came in gray and wet. The fog in the valley so thick that the trees 10 feet from the door were shapes rather than objects. He was up before the light had fully arrived, moving quietly, rebuilding the fire and heating water, and examining the road through a gap in the door boards with the same unhurried attention he gave everything. No movement in the fog, but fog was its own kind of cover. And the absence of visible movement was not evidence of absence. She was up within minutes of him, moving with the immediate full wakefulness of someone who had learned to sleep light. She rapped her foot. He saw this only at the edge of his attention, not by looking directly, with a strip of cloth from her pack, tight but not careless, the hands working with the knowledge of someone who had done this before. Then she ate from her own rations, standing, watching the fog through the door gap he had left. "The wrapping will hold for half a day," he said. "I know how long it will hold. River crossing before the next post station. Cold. I've crossed cold rivers." He looked at her then, and she was already looking back, and the brief exchange that passed between them was not agreement exactly, not the warmth of agreement, but the clean, simple recognition of two people who had been estimating each other since the previous afternoon and had arrived, without discussion, at the same conclusion. He shouldered his pack. She shouldered hers. They went out into the fog. The men found the abandoned post station 40 minutes after they left. He knew this not because he saw it, but because the sound of voices carried clearly in the fog, the sharp, flat sound of discovery, and then the rapid reconfiguration of direction. And he did not increase his pace because increasing his pace would cost her something she couldn't afford to give, and there was no calculation in which that made sense. She heard it too. He knew because her stride tightened, not faster, but more deliberate, the energy redirected from endurance into precision. She did not look back. He did not look back. The road south in the fog was 30 minutes from the river crossing, and the river crossing was what mattered. He had known rivers like this one, mountain-fed, spring-swollen, the cold coming off the surface in a visible shimmer even through fog. The crossing point was marked by two posts driven into the bank on each side. An old ferry operation long since abandoned, the rope guide still strung between them but sagging into the water at mid-channel. The depth at the crossing was perhaps hip height in normal flow. In snowmelt season it would be chest height on someone of her build. He looked at the rope, at the current, at her. "There's a ford upstream," she said. 20 minutes. They're 40 minutes behind, maybe 30 now. She looked at the river. Her expression was the expression of someone doing arithmetic they don't like the results of. He removed his outer layer and tied his pack high and waded in without further discussion. The cold was immediate and total. The kind of cold that hits the body like a statement of fact and requires no elaboration. He found the footing rocky, uneven, the current pushing hard at mid-channel, and turned back toward the bank. Extending his hand not as an offer but as a practical tool, the same way he might extend a branch to someone climbing out of a ditch. She looked at the hand for precisely 1 second and then took it and stepped in. The crossing took 4 minutes. She did not make a sound. Her grip was efficient, not clinging, not reluctant, the pressure calibrated to what the current actually required. At mid-channel, where the water reached her lower ribs, she inhaled through her nose and released through her mouth and continued moving. The water pulling at her clothing with the patient insistence of something that did not have opinions about whether she survived or not. On the far bank, she released his hand and walked 10 paces upstream and stood with her back to him, wringing water from her jacket with the focused, methodical efficiency of someone who could not afford to be cold for long and was not going to be. He pulled himself fully onto the bank and shook water from his gear without comment. Behind them, through the fog, the river continued its indifferent argument with its banks. The voices on the other side arrived 8 minutes later. He heard them reach the crossing point. Heard the assessment that followed, the quick, hard words of people recalculating. Heard one voice argue for the upstream ford, and another voice argue against it with more heat than the argument warranted, which meant fatigue and frustration and the particular demoralization of having come close and then encountered the one thing they hadn't prepared for. The fog was still thick. The ford was 20 minutes upstream. She had turned back toward him by then, her face composed, water still dripping from the ends of her hair where it had escaped the wrapping she'd been using to bind it. She was watching the far bank through the gray air with the same quality of attention she'd given the road the previous day, not anxious, not relieved, the mind simply continuing to work. He handed her the dry inner layer from his pack without explaining why he had a dry inner layer. She took it without explaining why she was accepting it. She turned away to make the change, and he sat on a rock and dried his feet with the same methodical efficiency she'd shown with her jacket, and neither of them made anything of any of it. She said, handing back the layer, "You were dry the whole crossing." A statement, not gratitude, not accusation, simply the observation of someone who had just noticed that what she'd assumed was shared disadvantage had in fact been a unilateral offer. The dry layer had always been dry. He had kept it dry on purpose, the way someone keeps something in reserve for a reason they have already decided on but have not announced. He took the layer back and repacked it. The ford. She said after a moment, 20 minutes upstream if they're efficient, 15 if they run. They won't run, they're already tired. Then 20. She looked south down the road, which disappeared into fog 50 meters out. And he could see her calculating how far to the next post station, what condition her foot was in, whether 20 minutes was enough margin, whether margin was even the right framework. He let her calculate without interrupting it. "There's a branching," she said finally, 2 hours south. "The right fork goes to the coast road through the mountain cut. 3 days in good weather. The left fork," she paused. "I know the left fork," he said. "It goes nowhere useful." It goes to the logging settlement at Takagi, 4 days but lower elevation. He looked at her. And everyone uses the right fork. She was quiet for a moment, then, they'll expect me to take the right fork. Yes. The left fork costs a day. Yes, she looked at the road, at the river, south. What were you going to do, she said, before the crossing point at the branching? He picked up his pack. South, he said. She nodded once. The nod of someone receiving information and integrating it, and they walked. The 2 hours to the branching passed in the particular silence of people who are conserving, not heat, not energy, but something harder to name. The resource that gets depleted by unnecessary words and replenished only by quiet. And both of them had learned this early and in different ways, and arrived at the same practice from opposite directions. The fog began to thin near midday as the road climbed out of the valley section, and the trees opened on one side to reveal a hillside, already showing the first raw green of early spring growth under the retreating snow. She was walking steadily, but he was watching the left foot, and he could see the drag had returned, not worse than before, but restored to what it had been in the late afternoon of the previous day, which meant the wrapping had done what it could and the muscles had met their limit. She did not mention it. She was not going to mention it. At a place where a flat rock jutted over a cold spring, he stopped and sat down and unpacked the meal without theater. And she sat beside him without comment, and they ate looking at the hillside and the retreating snow and the first small birds moving. Through the new growth, darting and absolute, he had cut the portions larger than the previous night. She did not mention this either. "You're not going to the coast," she said. It wasn't quite a question. "No, the logging settlement at Takagi." "Something like that." She looked at the hillside. "I have a brother at the coast. He's been there 7 years. He doesn't know," she stopped, reconsidered. "He doesn't know the circumstances." He waited. "I mean to arrive before anyone can tell him differently," she said. He understood this. The geometry of it, the race between a person and the story that was being told about them, the need to be present in person before the story arrived. He understood it well enough that he did not need her to elaborate and did not ask her to. "The left fork," he said. "First day there's a hunter's shelter. Half a day past that there's a village, small, the kind that doesn't ask about travelers. By the time they've decided which fork you took, you're past the cut-through at Komi Pass and they've lost 2 days." She was quiet, absorbing the route. "Why do you know all of this?" she said. "I've walked it." She looked at him with that particular quality of assessment he'd been seeing since the previous afternoon, the look of someone who was not fooled by laconic answers but had decided, provisionally, that the laconic answers were actually answers and not evasions. Then she looked back at the hillside. "Leaving the road," she said. "Yes. I've been on the road since," she stopped again. Whatever the ending of that sentence was, she had decided it was not necessary. "I've been on the road. I know." She put down the last of her meal and looked at her hands, not in distress, not in sentiment, simply looking at her hands with the eyes of someone conducting an inventory. They were not the hands he would have expected from the clothing she'd chosen, or from the careful construction of her appearance. They were rougher than that, capable, the hands of someone who had been doing sustained physical work for some time. She caught him looking and looked back at him steadily, no expression. "The left fork," she said. "Left fork," he said. She stood and repacked with the clean economy of someone who had been packing and unpacking on the move long enough that the action required no thought, and when she shouldered her pack and turned toward the road, there was something fractionally different in her posture, not lighter, nothing as simple as that, but more forward-facing. The weight distributed toward what was ahead rather than arranged against what was behind. The branching came an hour later, and they took the left fork without ceremony. The road narrowing immediately into something more like a suggestion than a path, the cedar closing in and the light going green and filtered. The sound of the main road, the occasional creak of a distant cart. the theoretical presence of other people, disappeared within 20 minutes, and then it was just the two of them in the green-filtered light, and the sound of the last snow releasing from the upper branches in soft, irregular collapses. They walked without speaking, and the walking had by now developed its own rhythm, the small adjustments of pace and spacing that two people develop when they have been moving together long enough. He had slowed his stride by perhaps 5% without deciding to. She had maintained the same pace for 3 hours without adjusting, which was longer than he expected. An hour before the light failed, he found the hunter's shelter, a low structure built into the hillside, the roof turf-covered and the walls of stacked cedar, a door of fitted boards that opened without resistance. Inside, dry wood already split and stacked, a stone fire pit, hooks in the ceiling, the smell of resin and old smoke, and the specific cleanness of a space that had been used carefully and left carefully. He built the fire. She sat with her boot removed, examining the foot with the focused attention of someone who is capable of making an unsentimentally accurate assessment of damage and does not require encouragement to do so. The ankle was swollen, not dramatically but measurably, and she pressed the joint with her thumbs in specific places with the systematic approach of someone who knew what they were looking for. Not the joint, she said to herself, or to no one. Tendon. He took a small bundle from the bottom of his pack, wrapped in wax cloth, tied with cord, and set it beside her without explanation. She untied it. Dried herbs in 3 separate portions, each folded in their own paper. She looked at them. "The yellow one," he said, not looking up from the fire. "And the brown, not the gray one." She looked at the herbs, then at him. "Mountain healer at Takagi Pass," he said. "Traded it for chopped wood. It's for soft tissue." She looked at the herbs for another moment with an expression that was not gratitude and not suspicion, but something between them. The expression of someone reassessing a situation and finding the new assessment less clear-cut than the previous one. Then she separated the yellow and brown portions and set about preparing the poultice with the competence of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. He watched her briefly. The fire found its pace and the room warmed, and the light outside the door gaps went from gray to dark and stayed dark, and the wind in the cedar had the fuller sound of night wind. Deeper and less specific. She said, not looking up from her work, "How long ago did you stop having someone to report to?" And the question landed in the quiet room, with the weight of something that had been considered for a long time before being spoken. Not an intrusion, but an attempt at accounting 2 people on a left fork in a darkening forest trying to understand, without the language for it, what kind of territory they were actually in. He looked at the fire. 12 years, he said. She nodded, not commiseratively, just receiving the number. "I'm not going back," she said. It was not clear whether she was speaking of the road behind them, the place she had left, the life that had contained her until it didn't. It had the quality of a thing said to oneself in the presence of a witness, which is different from saying it alone and different from saying it to someone. "I know," he said. She finished the poultice and wrapped the foot with the remaining cloth and lay back on the sleeping platform with her arm across her eyes. And the fire breathed, and the cedar breathed, and the room held its temperature. And he sat watch in the way he had sat watch for 12 years. Not dramatically, not theatrically, simply not sleeping, because sleeping fully in an uncertain situation was a habit he had never reacquired and did not expect to. "At some point deep in the night," she said, without moving her arm from her eyes, "they won't take the left fork." "No," he said. "You knew that before the branching." He didn't answer. Because the answer was obvious and they both knew it, and saying it would have been the kind of thing that required a response she might not want to give. She moved her arm from her eyes and looked at the ceiling. The fire had burned to coals again. The room in deep orange half-dark. "When you reach Takagi," she said, "there's work, there's usually work." "Chopping wood," she said, not mockingly, Chopping wood, he said. A long pause. My brother will have questions, she said. Yes. About the road, she stopped. You crossed a river in spring snowmelt, he said. You walked on a bad tendon for 3 days. You slept in 2 abandoned structures and 8 cold rations, and outpaced 4 hired men who had a day's head start on the road. You can answer his questions. She was quiet for long enough that he thought she had finally slept. But then she said very quietly, not as if to him, but in the way of someone checking an internal measurement against an external reference. I wasn't sure I could. And she said it in the tone of someone who has just found that the measurement holds. Morning, the tendon was better measurably, genuinely better, the swelling reduced by half, the range of motion restored to something functional. She tested it in the doorway while he packed, and the assessment in her face was the clean assessment of good news processed without excess, neither celebration nor relief, simply the integration of a changed fact. They ate. They left. The left fork continued through cedar for most of the morning, and then broke into open hillside around midday, the sky above the mountains showing the pale, sharp blue of a day that had decided to be clear. And the light when it hit the hillside was the light of early spring at altitude, brilliant and specific, every surface casting a short, precise shadow. Below them, visible for the first time in 2 days. The main road was a line of brown against the valley floor, and on it, very small, the shapes of 4 men walking north, retracing. She stopped and looked at them for a moment. He did not stop, but he slowed. She caught up and they continued along the hillside without speaking about it, and the main road fell away below them, and eventually disappeared behind the next ridge, and they were walking in light that had no name for the quality it carried. Only the quality itself, the warmth of a thing that has been cold for a long time beginning, with patience, to change. By mid-afternoon the village was visible small, as he had said. The thatched roofs showing above the tree line at the far end of a wide, shallow valley. She looked at it for a long moment, and he watched her look at it, and the calculation happening in her face was no longer a calculation about danger or distance or tendon or cold water. It was something else. The calculation of a person who has been moving toward something for a long time and is now close enough that moving toward it and arriving at it have become almost the same thing. 2 days to the coast road from here, she said. About that. She looked at the village. Then south, where the cut-through at Comey Pass would take her to the coast road and the coast road would take her to her brother. She turned and looked at him. He was already shouldering his pack for the continuation of his own route, his back to the village, his face toward the northern ridge where the logging settlement waited with its work, and its cold, and its lack of questions. He had not stopped moving, not exactly, but he had slowed enough that the slowing was legible. She said nothing for a moment. He said nothing. The wind off the mountain came down through the cedar with the smell of snowmelt and pine resin, and the particular cold sweetness of high-altitude air in early spring. And the village below went about its business in the distant small ways of villages, a figure crossing a courtyard, the sound of something being struck at the blacksmith's, a child's voice briefly and then not. "Safe road," she said. "Safe road." He said. What passed between them in the 3 seconds before he turned north and she continued south was not anything that could be named without diminishing it. It was simply the look of 2 people who had been, for 3 days, the only reliable thing in each other's immediate world, acknowledging this without sentiment and without evasion, the way you acknowledge a river crossing after you've made it, not with words about the cold, but with the quiet fact of being on the other bank. He walked north, she walked south. The cedar closed behind each of them in its own time, the trees indifferent. The light continuing its work on the hillside, with the patience of things that do not require the events happening in them to conclude in any particular way. The snow at the margins of the path was still retreating, millimeter by millimeter. From the cedar roots and where it retreated it left behind the year's first ground moss, very green, very small, already entirely itself. The road south went on. The road north went on. Both roads were the same road. In the end, the kind that doesn't ask where you've been, only whether you intend to keep walking. Would you have taken the left fork, knowing it added a day, or would you have trusted the main road and the distance you already had?